Okay, hello and good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's online seminar. It's part of our hybrid working series, recognising that many contact centre operations in the UK and across the world are going through a bit of a learning opportunity to introduce a hybrid working model. And today we are focused on the compliance and security side of hybrid models. So I am delighted that we have got a fantastic panel today. And today's event is also supported by TalkDesk. So very much thanks to TalkDesk for supporting us on this one today. So I'm going to ask our four panelists to hopefully put on their videos and to join me on screen. We have Pauline Smith, who is Director of Action Fraud at City of London Police. She's also a National Advisor for the National Police Chiefs Council on Contact Management. So Pauline, please do put your video on and come and join us. I am also going to introduce you to Mark Crowley, who is Group Head of Risk and Management at Theo Paphitis Retail Group. And you have brands there, Mark, including Ryman's and Robert Dyer. So Mark, please do put your video on. It was good to see you just then. And we also have John Greenwood, who has been quite instrumental around PCI compliance in the industry over the years. So delighted to have you join us, John. And Edgar Pimenta, who is VP of Information Security at TalkDesk. First of all, I am going to invite you all just to say a couple of words about your expertise in this area of compliance and security. And I'm going to invite anybody that's interested in asking a question. Please do use the Q&A functionality. We have Q&A functionality available through the platform. Please do use it. It is an interactive session. I have got a shed load of questions that I want to ask these guys, but also open to yours. If you have a question you want to ask, please do put it in the Q&A and I shall position it to one or more of our panelists. So Pauline, please introduce yourself.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, I'm Pauline Smith. I'm the Director of Action Fraud. So Action Fraud is the National Fraud and Cyber Crime Reporting Centre for the UK, and it's housed in the City of London Police. I've been in policing for 36 years, so just about got the hang of it, I reckon. And around, if you like, police control rooms and contact centres over the last few years in particular. Expertise, certainly not security expertise, but running operational contact centres and operational control rooms. I've got plenty of knowledge around that. So that's me. Thanks, Lee.
Perfect. Thank you, Pauline. Mark, please do share your, introduce yourself and share your expertise in this area.
So I'm Mark. I'm the Head of Risk Management for Theo Paphitis Retail Group. Most people know us for Theo's time on Dragon's Den, but we own the brands Ryman, Robert Dyer's and Boo Avenue. I joined the business 15 months ago as the head of risk, and one of our top risks is obviously customer experience is an outcome of one of our risks. And about 4 months ago, Theo asked me to pick up executive accountability for our customer service department, because it's fair to say we've had some challenges during the pandemic, like most big retailers. But my background is loss prevention and risk management, having worked at John Lewis, Burberry, and a number of other retailers over the past 10 years. So yeah, so contact center is relatively new to me, but as I say to everybody, and I think I said to you, Lee, I shop well and managed to spend my salary quite a lot in retailers. So customer service, we're all customers first, and frankly, getting the right people, process and technology, just like risk management is key for us in customer service. So yeah, I'm currently leading our transformation project.
Thank you, Mark. And I think that your career history is fascinating, and the fact that you've come from a risk management perspective and now responsible for customer management, it's going to be interesting to explore that a little bit over the next hour. John, if I may come to you and invite you to introduce yourself, please, John.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Hi, everyone. John Greenwood from CCP. I look after the tech and payments compliance there. CCP's a support business, really, customer engagement support business, helping people source contact centers, but also tech that supports the contact centers. Started in the contact centers in the 80s, setting up home working for a company that I owned, sold that, and then joined outsourcing in 92. Small business called Decisions Group that we grew from sort of 2 million to 56 million over 5 years, and sold it to Sitel Corporation. That became Sitel Europe. And we helped organizations transition to use the telephone as a business tool. So I ran a team where we ran build, operate, transfer, so set up a couple of direct banks, 5 direct insurance companies, home shopping for a couple of organizations, that sort of thing. And with compliance, over the last 8 years, I've been specializing in payments. I was asked by the payment card schemes and the PCI Council back about 6 years ago now, 7 years ago, to actually write the current guidance. So I drafted the current guidance on the applicability of the PCI DSS to contact centers and the supply chain. So that's where I'm able to help most of you today.
Perfect. Thank you, John. And really pleased to have you on board on this session today with your deep-rooted PCI compliance knowledge.
Status. Yeah.
Thank you. And Edgar, please introduce yourself too.
Hello, everyone. Edgar Pimenta from TalkDesk. So basically, TalkDesk is a company that provides cloud software to manage a contact center, everything on the cloud. And I've joined TalkDesk 3.5 years ago, and the goal was to improve our security and privacy program and to help us make sure our customers are comfortable with the level of security that we provide in our product, right? My background, I've always worked in security areas and privacy areas in the telco sector and then in the financial sector that are highly regulated markets, and that's where I had most of my backgrounds. And actually in the telco sector, contact center is a huge part of the customer experience. So we dealt with that and all the protections that we need to have, because GDPR is recent for everyone, but for telco sector, for example, there was a lot of privacy regulations far before GDPR, and contact center was always a focus to protect customer information for sure, right? And that's a little bit my background. I've been working in security and in the components of awareness, policies, risk management processes around security, and I manage the security program at TalkDesk.
Excellent. Thank you, Edgar. So we have a panel of 4 quite outstanding individuals. So if you have got a question for them, please do use the Q&A. But Pauline, I'm going to start with you. You have run contact center operations for a few years, and obviously we've had that migration to home working, and obviously the whole point of our hybrid working series is to support contact center leaders as they start to make some of those decisions around that future of hybrid working. But what are the biggest issues that are facing contact center operations right now? What are the fraudulent threats? Where is it coming from?
Yeah, I think some of the biggest issues really is around making sure that your information is secure and that your people aren't at risk of being targeted by fraudsters. So for us, it's around sort of the vetting side of things and whether people are financially secure, because fraudsters will look for people who are not financially secure, and then they will target them, and they'll target them in order to get information and data, and they'll pay very well. So that is quite a big risk for the industry itself. And it's just to be mindful that, if some of your people that work for you are really short of money, then that makes them vulnerable. And, when people are desperate and vulnerable, then they're like sitting ducks, to be quite honest. We haven't seen an explosion of it at the moment, but it is something that to be really mindful of your vetting, and it's a different life now, people working from home, isn't it?
Interesting. And that whole vulnerable piece, we talk a lot about vulnerable customers. We don't talk so much about vulnerable employees.
Yeah, that's right, and we have got to think about it now. And with fraud and cybercrime is the only growing crime in the world, and particularly in the UK. So fraudsters will always look for vulnerabilities. So they'll use COVID for example. My campaign about fraud in puppies and kittens is just launched yesterday, and the vulnerability there is because you can't go and see them. So the fraudster will pick on what is vulnerable, and then they will target it. And then we see this moving all the time around the trends. Everybody's online shopping. Oh, great, fraudsters can do that. Everybody had the phone calls, the phishing phone calls. Well, that's because you're at home. So there's been an explosion of phone calls. So the national insurance scam, HMRC scam. So it's that vulnerability we've got to watch, I think.
Interesting. So we've had a question come in, and it's really relevant to what you've just been talking about. So I am going to jump straight in and ask you, how would you vet someone's financial stability?
Well, we do. We do background checks. We look at the credit card checks, and we basically ask them as well on the forms, which we have to do for policing anyway. But yeah, we do background checks on them. But if you didn't have that in place, I would certainly, brief people if you were bringing them in around how they could become vulnerable, so they're aware of it. That would be another way. But in policing, we have to do that check. And
I guess that there's an element of, depending on the your contact center operation, the culture of your operation, as to how easy that bringing in something like that is. And actually, I mean, that's something we've talked about around the culture of a contact center and trust. That's quite a major thing. We've talked about it on our seminars before. And Pauline, when you and I spoke briefly yesterday, we touched on the human rights and the laws regarding privacy. What solutions are available to really enhance that that privacy and build on trusting relationships while balancing the protection of data and information?
Yeah, it's a good one. I know some centres, when you join them, you're told that you will have a webcam on you all the time, and that is part of the job. But I know certainly in my world, we aren't allowed to do that. And I do know that there has been some challenges around people's individual privacy under the Human Rights Act. So what we've done is we have a solution called SecureX, I think it's called. And it's not on all the time, and it will only activate if there's some not right behaviour. So if you've got your camera out and put it in front of the screen, it actually shuts the screen down. If you've got somebody looking over your shoulder, and it's going to be in close proximity, it's quite a clever system, and it will only come on if you've got activities that you shouldn't actually be doing. So it's about having trust in staff, but it's also about protecting that information. So if your child does pop the face over, it will just shut the computer down. And same with your husband, or it does recognise animals, though, I have to say. So if the cat comes across the screen, it doesn't actually shut down, believe it or not. So which is a good thing. But yeah, it is balance, though. You've got to have trust in people. At the same breath, I deal with a lot of intelligence and a lot of information that criminals would like to get their hands on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you, Pauline. Edgar, I'm going to come to you if I may next. And your background, your knowledge, deep knowledge on security, what are the emerging security threats that are really relevant in the contact center right now?
So I think a lot of the new threats that we have facing all companies also apply to contact centers, right? But and piggyback on something that Pauline was saying, definitely social engineering is one of the biggest threats that we have, right? And when we're talking about social engineering, we can add phishing there. That can be by email, by phone, by any other ways, right? So any phishing mode can be used. And when people are at home, there's always a sense of comfortable, right? So they're a little bit more prone to fall into those social engineering methods because they're feeling at home, they're comfortable, they don't feel the pressure of the controls they have usually in the company. So social engineering can definitely be on the rise, right? And I think it's important for the companies to keep on pushing some awareness, some education to everyone, to make sure that, okay, even now that you're at home, don't forget that there's a couple of things that you still need to do, right? Simple habits like make sure you lock your computer when you're not in your desk, right? Even if you're at home, it's a safe environment, but you need to keep those controls in place and make sure people keep doing that, right? Because social engineering, for sure, it's going to be one of the biggest ones, and that meaning that phishing, ransomware, for sure, it's increasing everywhere. Everyone is seeing that increase. And I think one thing that Pauline mentioned, and I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges regarding threats for contact center, is the financial temptation, right? For sure, sometimes people that are in contact center are not the most well paid, right? So they're really sometimes a little bit more prone to fall into those social engineering, either by mistake, either because they're not just fully committed to the company and to the company awareness and education programs, or just because they're unhappy and they just looking for different sources of income. So that's definitely a big threat that we have there, right? So it's always, I think it's very important for the companies to deal with this, having their own, as I was mentioning, security and education programs, enforcing them periodically, and people knowing that, of course, respecting the privacy of the employees, but making sure their actions are being tracked, are being audited, and they need to know that, right? Because they need to know that if they do something that they shouldn't, they can be pointed at, right? So if they are aware of that, before doing something that is not by mistake, that is a bad behavior, there's always a rationalization process, right? You always think, should I do this? Should I do this? Is my company paying me enough? And you try to find reasons for doing something that you shouldn't, right? And if you enforce people that we are tracking what you're doing, if you do something that you shouldn't, you'll be responsible for that. People will rationalize in a different way, and eventually they say, maybe I shouldn't do this because even I can get some profit, but I can have also a lot of problems, so let's avoid that. So making sure that the rationalization process for the people always goes in a way that they really think about, should I do this? Is it worth it? I think it's a very important, and this, for this you have to do continuous awareness training and people to be aware of that.
And I guess as well as the human aspect and the human behavior and getting some best practice, you know, like you say, making sure that your computer's locked out or switched off when you're not at it. I guess there's what we've obviously also seen is that drive to the cloud and the need for security from a technology perspective. And I assume that it's the technology that can really prevent some of these security threats from coming through.
Yeah, technology helps, right? But security has three vectors, right? Technology, process, and people, right? They need to work together to have success, right? You can put the best technology, but if you don't train people, if you don't give awareness to people, technology will not solve everything. Of course, it helps, right? Process is the same thing. You need to have a lot of process to make sure if you detect something that you prevent that from spreading, that you have a containment process. So all of that exists, and technology is for sure fundamental. Some of the examples that Pauline was mentioning, it's technology that detects a second people and blocks your computer, for example. That's technology, right? But people will if people really want to do something, they will always try to find a way to circumvent technology, right? That's why technology for itself doesn't do everything. It's very important for the human factor to be aware of it. And we have, and I think if going back a little bit to the threats that we have, the cyber world has an effect on all of us, right? Where it's what I call the familial stranger, right? Where sometimes a stranger that we would not probably talk in the street, if they talk to us in the cyber world and they seem to be familiar, or we get some sympathy with them, we may be able to talk to them and provide more information that we would in real life, right? And this is even it's even a bigger problem when you're working from home, right? Because you're in a safe environment, so you believe that your brain has the feeling that I'm in a safe environment, so I'm okay, right? But you're talking with people, or you might be connecting with people that don't have the same feeling, and that can be also a challenge. So people, for me, is fundamental in terms of being the first defense for the company.
Yeah, I agree. And John, there's a question coming, and it's kind of prompted my next question. So we've kind of looked at the fraudulent side, and we've been looking at the security issues. But John, you've been really heavily involved in the PCI compliance piece. You shared what your background was, and you know, how can organizations really ensure compliance? And the question that's come in is, how do you prevent people simply writing down information when working at home? John, how do you do PCI compliance?
Hey, super simple, right? People think PCI compliance is a pain in the ass, right? And they're right? It is. It's troublesome, let's say, right? But there's one way to solve the problem and take this away. Think about it. You've got two choices, right? You can choose to have card data in your environment, right? In which case you've got to secure it, deploy technology, which to Edgar's point, right? But to Pauline's point earlier, we've got vulnerable employees, not just because they might be under financial strain, because we've spent 20 years, you know, trying not to pay people more than we need to, right? Generalization, I know. But by having card data in the environment, we make people vulnerable, because card data is just very attractive to criminals, because we can monetize it. Criminals can monetize card data so much more easily at such higher value than a name and address, right? So we've got to make it easy for our frontline people to do the great job they want to do. Yeah, nobody sets out to do a bad job. Nobody sets out to defraud anybody, right? It's just simple. Let's think about not having card data in the environment. Now, why is that important? It's important because the Data Protection Act, right, it's a legal thing where PCI is a contractual thing. The Data Protection Act is a legal obligation to keep personal data secure. And card data is personal data, just very attractive personal data to criminals. So we've got to think about preventing card data entering the contact center environment, prevent card data entering the supply chain environment, because it brings the supply chain into scope. And it means that the merchant, i.e. typically the call center, or the call center outsourcing vendor, they've got to have an attestation of compliance. They've got to have evidence that they're keeping the card data secure. So think about it as a strategy, a data retention or data protection strategy. Minimize the data footprint. That's your starting point. And then you can get thinking into technology.
And I guess that as well as card data, there's other data that obviously, in order to do their jobs, frontline colleagues, they need access to potentially a lot of data. But I guess there's ways that you give them access to the data that they need for that particular moment.
Yeah, I think that's to Edgar's point again. You know, it's about the appropriate technology to secure the endpoint. You know, and there's some fantastic technologies around. There's great engineering around, British engineering, but also the global engineering that gives some fantastic solutions that the CCAS community have access to and have built in typically to their solutions. You know, securing the desktop, tokenizing data, jumbling up data so that it prevents keyloggers working, keyloggers that can be downloaded through phishing exercises, to Pauline's point earlier. So I think having a holistic approach, listening to your information security folk, listening to specialist agencies like Pauline's and the CCAS, your CCAS vendors like TalkDesk. They're going to give you a real good understanding of the possibilities. But fundamentally, you've got to have a strategy that minimizes the data footprint, give our frontline teams the best opportunity to do a great job.
Yeah, thank you. So Mark, you're responsible for risk, your background is risk. These are a shed load of risks going on right now, especially with colleagues working from home. What's your take on what's going on right now?
My biggest concern from a risk management perspective is mental well-being. So often in a call centre, you deal with complaints and dissatisfied customers. And you have, to John's point, people relatively low paid who are taking abusive calls and elements at home at their dining table where they haven't got home offices, etc. And I think when you play that through to a fraud lens, then how do you keep that emotive connection with an organisation? I can see a question that's come in the log that's quite similar, which is, you know, people when they steal or dishonest, if we think of the internal threat, often their biggest fear is the repercussions of when they're caught, from the shame and the humiliation of, well, will my colleagues know? Will my boss know? And that's true of call centres and traditional retail. So I think finding a way of engaging your workforce, which, you know, is full circle to some of these conversations you've been having, Lee, and leading, and keeping your employees engaged and feeling like they're part of an organisation and not a node that is just there to take calls and process, will stop some of what Edgar talked about, which is that rationalisation, and will be a personal control. And then realistically, these threat vulnerabilities are still there, and people will be taken advantage. We know phishing scams will happen. So for me, it's then breaking it down between your insider threats and your external threats. And from your insider threats, they are going to happen. And one of the things I'm working with our team on is actually just making sure we've got the best detective reporting we can and technology to help us so that we can empower and encourage, because the vast majority of our workforce are honest. The vast majority of every workforce is honest, but there will always be bad actors, and you've just got to make sure that you can spot them quickly before they do any real damage, because you can't limit all of your systems. There's just a reality. And sadly, from an external perspective, my view, and from an information security perspective, would be is how sophisticated your home working setup is. I mean, are you in crisis mode of an organization where people are accessing all of your cloud-based servers from their own device at any point, and therefore you've got a big vulnerability of the end device? Or have you got a sophisticated infrastructure, which means actually you've got device security, which stops at some level external attacks and gives you some level of control if someone does click on the wrong link for a phishing scam? And you know, we all know friends, family, neighbours that have fallen victim, sadly, to the types of scams that Pauline is publicising about. So we know it happens, and we know external people will target us every day. So for me, it starts with employee engagement and welfare, and then it moves into you know, adapting your control environment to go, have we truly stepped back and gone, right, where is our business at now? Is this a crisis? Are we coming back out of it? And if not, what changes have we got to make? Because the odds are your existing managers and people, if you were set up for in-house at desk working, won't have necessarily stopped to pause and think about all of those differences of just even how people are building human connections with the organisation.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to come to some of the questions that we've had come through on the feed. And Pauline, I think I'm going to come to you with the first question I'm going to ask, and that is, what action do people or should people take where fraud is suspected by a customer, and what evidence is required?
That's the evidence required bit all depends what the fraud is. Fraud is very complex, but if you do suspect that fraud has been committed, then either ring us or go onto the website actionfraud.police.uk or do a web chat. We're there to give advice, guidance, or we'll take a report. And as I say, reports are really complex, so it's the detail of what's happened. Sometimes some people don't even know what's happened to them, but our advisors will talk you through that. So it's quite different being in our call centres. If you compare it to 999 or 101, they're relatively straightforward because people really know what's happened to them. if you're at a road traffic collision, you know you're in a road traffic collision. This is different. Our call takers really start the investigation at first point of contact, and they do pull the information from you if you don't know what's happened. So in terms of what you need, they'll talk that through with you, and each case is completely different. Could be organised crime routes, it could be somebody just trying their hand. Yeah, so it's difficult to say what you need. You need the detail, you need the information, and as much as possible to be able to put a report in there.
And I mean, there are contact centres that will have their approach to if there is a suspected fraudulent call, but I guess that the end point, starting point for you guys, but the end point for them may well be to get in touch with Action Fraud. Yeah,
it's always worth doing, because again, you know, on web chat we can give advice and guidance of what to do and how to spot things. So yeah, always drop us a line, give us a call. We're there, and we'll help. We always do.
Perfect, thank you. Mark, I'm going to come back to you with one of the other questions, and it's one of the first questions we had in. What steps do you take if a long-serving member of staff's financial situation changes?
I think the key is to create a world where people want to talk to you about their financial position. I've sadly, in the one case I once investigated, was an individual who wanted to be a police officer, ironically, and he ended up stealing from a business I worked in because he couldn't afford his travel to work and took it from a till. So I think the first thing you've got to do is try and create an environment where people want to talk to you about their financial pressures. And then secondly, you've got to be an organisation that wants to hear it and help. Because if not, and they're under financial pressures, they will find alternative ways. And sadly, if you've got people on low paid jobs that have ready access to conduct refunds or card data, etc., and they're in financial difficulties, most people would do a lot to feed their family. So I think you've got to try and create and nurture a world where people will talk to you. And then I think you've got to deal with it on a case-by-case basis, Lee. I don't think there's one size fits all, but I work for businesses where you support the employee and you come up with ways of helping. And inwardly, we do that here at TPRG. And then there's things like retail trust for retailers, and I'm sure there's equivalents in financial services. So to promote mental well-being schemes and avenues for people to talk to, because it will happen to some of your workforce.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. John, I'm going to come to you with one of the questions, and it's an interesting one. It's one I actually want to know as well. Do people consider bank account details to have the same sensitivity as payment card details?
It's interesting, isn't it? It's a good question. The PCI DSS applies only to cards, right? It's the Data Protection Act that applies to our bank accounts. And interestingly, you know, those bank account details are going to get of higher and higher value, simply as we're going to do more banking to banking payments or account to account payments. So we're seeing the rise of open banking. We're seeing the rise of digital transformation of our customer contact centers. We're doing more non-voice transactions now than we used to. And we're also doing payments through non-voice transactions. In other words, chat payments, digital payments, right? And then we're going to do more and more of that, right? Particularly as the kids, you know, my kids who never talk to their mates, they just talk with their thumbs, right? You know, voice is a bit inconvenient to them, a bit too personal. So we're going to see more chat. We're going to see more convergence between the contact center and the e-commerce side, and that's going to promote more banking apps, the use of banking apps. I tell you, we did some work recently just testing open banking applications versus old-fashioned voice applications, even using such proven technologies as people might understand it as DTMF, attended telephony payments, inputting card details into the telephone, right? Now, we've all lived through COVID, hopefully, the ones of us here. We find it an inconvenience to start putting 4 digits into a retail environment. We're all using contactless. So why the hell would you want to put 16 and 19 digits down your phone taking payments? But you'd happily speak it and leave your bank details on a call recorder, And there's no regulation to stop you yet. And the payments regulator's got to begin to do something about this. So I think we've got to really think about recording bank account details and think of it as something, oh, we don't need to bother with that. Hell, we will. Now then, the big underlying reason for this is that a card company will always give you money back from fraud. The banks, they're not so keen to take that position. They're putting all sorts of things in front of us as consumers, right, that say we take the risk of the fraud. So cards are always going to be around, and cards will continue to have that advantage until the banking community front up and take the risk of fraud. They're going to leave all that with us as a consumer. So dead right, we've got to start thinking about bank account details as valuable data to criminals, because it just helps them cash in.
Yeah, and that you're right. It's not a PCI compliance bank data. It is a GDPR. It's personal data. It
Correct.
just happens to be higher value data.
Correct.
Yeah, interesting. Edgar, I'm going to come to you with we've got quite a long question that's come in, so I'm going to read it all out and come to you, Edgar, first for your advice. We are a local authority contact centre and do not deal with payments. The data we handle is sensitive as we take social care referrals, and the type of questions we have to ask and the details that need to be confirmed back are often very difficult and sometimes graphic in nature. Can the panel offer any advice on how we can ensure that data is not overheard in the home? And is there a way of enforcing that confidentiality in someone's home? Edgar, if I can come to you first, and then Pauline, I think I'll come to you.
So it's a hard one in the sense that it's a very specific context, right? Of course, trying to not to be overheard. Once again, it goes through education, right? So trying to help people having the awareness not to talk loud on certain specific points, right? And eventually, or when they're talking about specific information, right? And eventually enforcing some policies, like for example, sometimes when we have the working from home or remote working, sometimes people do work in other facilities other than home, right? In open areas and in cafes and things like that. So eventually enforce your policies that those people who are doing that, for sure, they need to be in a controlled environment, right? For example, their home. And if they're at home, and if it's possible, try to make sure they're in a specific area of the house, for example, right? But that goes very specifically to what is possible for each agent, right? So it may not be very easy to enforce that, right? But I would say that for sure, having some policies to reduce the risk and giving people some awareness, right? There's some, and trying to understand what are the difficulties that people may have in their own environment to prevent that, right? For example, one thing, very simple thing that sometimes I do when I'm around people is removing one of the headsets, right? So I can hear myself outside of the call and know if I'm talking too loud or not, right? Eventually try to have good headsets that are able to capture the sound without you having to talk that loud, right? And in this part, it's more on the technology side, but it's not an easy solution, because it's very behavior, right? It depends a lot on the agent.
Thank you, Edgar. Pauline, if I can come to you with the same question, and what advice can you give to ensure that data is not overheard in the home?
Yeah, I get that, because my advisors are talking to victims and it's sensitive and confidential. So it is policy. I'm afraid we are quite hard with our policies in terms of where you'll work within your own home. We even look during vetting at what type of dwelling somebody lives in. So if you're in a bed sit, I'm afraid it's not going to be suitable. I can't have you at the ironing board with your laptop in the middle of the kitchen. Just can't happen. So there's a vetting side. We've gone to the extent of we will vet your family now, as well as yourself, in terms of our information and data. And then it is around really the individual. Although the individual has some responsibility, it is in our policies that you will work in a closed room. And then we do a Zoom visit. We have done site visits to people's houses in terms of not just about the security side of being overheard, but also about their health and well-being. You know, they've got the right chair, they've got the right desk, they're okay. So it's sort of a double plus, really. I know you can't home visit loads of people, but we do a Zoom visit as well, just to see the setup of where individuals are working, because it's important for them as well as it is for us. So that's some of the things that we've got in place currently.
And I think that brings in another aspect of compliance and around health and safety. You know, we've talked about card compliance, we've talked about security, we've touched on, and maybe we'll come back to GDPR. But Mark, I'm going to come to you because the risk of getting health and safety wrong in a hybrid environment, I suspect, is relatively high.
Yes. The risk factor goes up exponentially, right? Because you've got different setups. So I would strongly encourage a lot of what Pauline said for a holistic risk assessment. And indeed, you know, it's one of the things I'm a big fan of, converging these things together. So, you know, realistically, if you're moving to a home working practice and it's not flexible working, you need to do home working risk assessments either in person or via a Zoom FaceTime call, and look at the setup and consider both the physical well-being of your colleagues, you know, the chair, the desk, the display screen, the environmental factors. You know, a lot of businesses in call centres have people who flat share, and you know, these people are booking time on communal desks in their living room. You know, but they want to keep home working because they don't want to have to pay for a commute or lunch. But we have a duty of care, and I think, unfortunately, as Pauline nodded to there, sometimes you have to be bold and brave enough to go, unfortunately, this isn't going to work for us. And as much as you're a great candidate, the setup just creates too much risk. And I think your company directors should be looking at D&O and liability insurance for the future, because there will be challenges that come on the back of COVID and legal challenges. And there is nothing that has given anyone an exemption from the Health and Safety at Work Act and our duty of care. And in fact, COVID just increases the pressures. So without a doubt, Lee.
And one of the comments that's just come in is completely agree. It covers three aspects: people, tech, and physical environment, not just for compliance and best practice, but also health and well-being, including mental health. And it's interesting how the conversation has very much focused on that. And I'm going to ask you one of the questions, Mark. I'm going to stick with you for a moment. As an industry, do we think it's fair to allow people to work from home if they have a suitable space, i.e. a home office, but insist that they have to work in the office if they haven't got a suitable space? Does that create a them and us type scenario, Mark?
I think any way where you've got different ways of working can create them and us, and employees, people generally crave parity, right? So it can, I think it's how you raise awareness, and it's sticking true to that why. So if people understand, if you have a suitable environment, and this is what a suitable environment looks like, then you can work in that scenario. But if not, we're giving you a suitable environment. It doesn't mean they'll like it though. And there's a big difference between understanding something and liking the decision that's come to at the end. Of course, the real challenge is how you get assurance as your function that what they're saying they can deliver, they can. And I don't think it's good enough just to take people's word. I do think, sadly, you need to do some Zoom visits, you need to do some home visits, because otherwise people will say things because they generally want an easier life, and they're good people doing the right thing, but we do have that duty of care, yes.
Interesting. John, I've got a question for you. We've talked about the compliance side of things. We've talked about how important it is to be compliant. We're also quite aware of the fact that back in March last year, when we were going through what we were going through as a world, that some of the standards were maybe dropped a little while we were all finding a new place. Are the regulators now very much back and hot on the heels of anybody that is not compliant? Is that what you're now sensing?
It is. It is. I think naturally there's been a period of realization where we're all trying to prioritize our actions around people, process, and technology, and which colleagues mentioned earlier. And I think the regulators are human as too, right? So they're looking at it, but right, the world's changed, and the world ain't going to change back, right? We're faced with a new scenario. We've found things out and valued things differently post-COVID. Our time and our families and loved ones have become much more important to us. And I think to get the most out of our employees, we have to acknowledge that, to Mark's point earlier, managing the risk. Yeah, but the regulators will start regulating. There are new regulations too around payments that are going to change our contact center industry forever in Europe. Payments regulations that are going to make the internet more secure, that are going to push criminal activity away from the internet towards the only more vulnerable channel, right? Because we've secured face-to-face transactions through chip and pin. We're securing internet transactions through strong customer authentication, which is in Payment Service Directive 2, yeah, that became law a couple of years ago, and the regulation enforcement through the regulators has been put back. We're seeing 15 to 40% e-com transaction failures across Europe, have been since the beginning of the year. April, May numbers were still at that 15, 30, 40% different countries. So we're going to see a massive change in our call center customer engagement profiles, because so many of our e-com transactions will begin to fail, right? And we'll see that this year, which means more payments in the contact center. And if contact centers are in this hybrid scenario, it means we're going to be taking payments in that shared working environment in people's homes. And from a PCI DSS standpoint, compliance standpoint, that means that all of the housing areas supporting your centralized working environment, they're part of your PCI DSS scope too, if your agents are still hearing card data. So you've got to think through, folks. You've got to really think this through, because you know, more fraud is going to start coming into our contact centers much sooner than you think.
So here's a question for you, John. Is the use of credit card data over the phone at home a no-no for PCI compliance? And would you need to bring those advisors back into the office while you seek a solution?
The technology is there to help you. You know, the CCAS community are aware of this. They're aware that their organizations are in scope. And there's a whole community of tech vendors, you know, about PCI scope reduction, using telephony and using digital, you know, using it in an attended format where the agent and the customer in constant voice contact. Great customer experience, that's available in telephony, which people refer to as DTMF. Also, IVR is another mechanism, but digital too, where you can get attended digital solutions, even attended digital solutions that deal with fraud by using 3D Secure, which is the card scheme's own customer validation, customer identity validation. So there's some great tech out there to enable you to get the most from your employees by preventing card data being listened to, being transmitted through your infrastructure. So I think the most important thing is to get your people in a position where they can do their very best for you to serve your customers. That's the priority, and help them by deploying technology that it will prevent spoken card data entering your infrastructure, which means you've got to deal with this pain in the neck, you know, PCI DSS. But it's customer experience. At the end of the day, how do you get the right balance between customer experience, risk, to Mark's point, and cost, which your treasury and financial folk will look at? But there are ways of dealing with this, and you see CAS vendors, and there's a 20-odd tech, you know, engineering firms just in the UK alone that build technology to do this. Some are multi-award winning, you know, digital solutions out there. We've got a fantastic global leading, you know, DTMF industry out there, all great engineering, all available to you. Just have a look up or talk to experts who can help. And no, there's a lot of tech available, some great engineering to help you give a great customer experience.
And I think I'm seeing it in terms of the different tech vendors that are out there, but I'm also quite aware of that cloud technology, and Edgar at Talkdesk, you're obviously very much in that space. What advice do you give around the kind of technology that organizations, and without talking about your own products, the types of technologies that that organizations should be looking at to enable that cloud environment, that secure, compliant cloud environment?
So there's not one fits all, right? What fits one organization may not fit another organization, right? And what we see with COVID, definitely the digital transformation accelerated in a lot of companies, right? For sure. But it goes around making sure you have the proper technology, but above all that you trust the providers, right? Because there's still when you're moving from on-premises to the cloud, there's always some feeling of losing control, right? And you want to make sure you have the sufficient level of control, and for that you need some trust, right? There's not one technology that works for all companies. What may work for one company may not work for the other company, right? We do have some solutions, like John mentioned, payment assisted or automated payments, to help reducing the scope for Talkdesk and for our customers. And I totally agree, from PCI compliance, being able to reduce the scope is fundamental, because it helps you a lot getting the being compliant and reducing your risks, because being compliant is basically is reducing your risks, right? But there's no one fits all, right? And doing for this digital transformation, we see that trust is something that needs to be built, and there are companies that already have good experience with cloud services and they trust going to the cloud, and there are companies that are still struggling with these changes, right? And it's a lot of trust, of course, but it's also a lot of the IT in a lot of companies. When we go to the cloud, they lose they have the sense of losing some empowerment, right? Because they're not managing the systems anymore, right? But they can help still, because they can help defining SLAs, operational SLAs, tracking those SLAs. So there's other things they can help with, but there's a sense of lose that sometimes it's hard for companies to deal. Because from a security perspective, and pushing to that ground, the fact that you have security resources are very hard to find nowadays, right? Everyone that is looking for security resources, they know people, they know that there's a huge shortage, right? And if you have everything on premises, you have to secure a lot of things, and you need to have specific security resources for that, right? If you're hiring cloud providers, hopefully they have their own security teams that are really focused on that service or in that product, and they will be protecting your information to the maximum, right? But as I was mentioning, this is a change. There is a lot of cultural change. People need to accept this, to embrace this, and to have good experience. Because if you have a bad experience going to the cloud, you will say, no, this doesn't work for me. Let's keep everything on premises and not move for the next 10 years, right? So if you have a bad experience, it will traumatize you for sure, right?
Thank you, Edgar. This has been fascinating. We have had some really interesting questions come through. We're just coming up to the hour, so I'm going to ask each of you your one piece of advice on the back of this conversation, what we've heard, thinking about organizations that are making some pretty tough decisions around moving to a more hybrid model. Mark, I'm going to come to you first. What's your top piece of advice?
I think it's just making sure you educate as part of your decision making, and realistically review your control environment. And I hate to use words, but your risk assessments. But if you use the right education to get to the why, anything can be overcome. But recognise there's going to probably be some costs associated with that if you don't currently operate in that way.
Thank you, Mark. John, I'm going to come to you next. What's your big piece of advice?
I think you've got to put your people, frontline people first, and because they're the ones that deliver the brand to your customers in spoken and written, the chat, etc. And to do that, you've got to respect their vulnerability, and you've got to actually keep data secure by design and default, which means reducing your footprint, preventing spoken card data entering that environment, free up your operation. Don't begin to treat people like criminals. They don't like it.
Thank you, John. Great piece of advice. Pauline, what's your big piece of advice? Oh, Pauline, I think we might have just lost you temporarily there. I shall come back to you. Edgar, what's your big piece of advice, please?
So John and Mark definitely touched very good points. Awareness for sure. Awareness is definitely one. And although we should not treat everyone as a criminal, I totally agree with John. So helping people, making sure they have what they need, make sure they have a way to say what they need. And from a security perspective, it's very important for them to know what should they do if something is wrong or if someone approaches them, because if they know how to report that and they see that something happens after that, they see they were helping. So definitely that is very important. And also, and this is something that we do very honestly at TalkDesk, we have a product for trying to understand behavior on agents and try to detect outliers, right? Because if you are able to detect outliers, it may be nothing, but maybe an early alert that something is wrong, right? So if you can have technology working for you on that sense, it's always very, very important. And of course, awareness or education in a good format, it's fundamental. People need to know what to do. They need to know what they can and cannot do, right?
Thank you, Edgar. And Pauline, I'm hoping to be able to get your big piece of advice if you are still able to join us.
I am still here, but can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Great, okay, thanks. Yeah, my one big piece of advice is about balance, about risk and risk mitigation, and it's about having clear policies, which is similar to what everybody else has said. But it is that risk about people, but it's risk about people that includes, in some people's case, customers, in my case, victims, as well as the people that deliver our service. So it's getting that balance and thinking it through, but having clear policies so people understand and they know what they're dealing with. I won't say people, I mean our people that deliver the service. That's my piece of advice.
Thank you so much, Pauline. What a fantastic panel we've had. This has been absolutely fascinating, an eye-opener, I am very much sure too. Thank you, Pauline. Thank you, John. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Edgar. And thank you, TalkDesk, for supporting us. And thank you for everybody for joining us today. And we hope you have a good rest of the day. Take care. Many thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.